Okay, I am speaking with James Danke and Dennis Kitchen, and we're going to be talking about Wisconsin Funnies, which is a retrospective of Midwestern comics, specifically Wisconsin. And I will do a little brief introduction, and then I'll let these gentlemen speak for themselves. Dennis Kitchen, for anybody into comics, you probably think, well, he doesn't need an introduction. He's a big name in comics, underground cartoonist, publisher, editor, founder of Kitchen Sink Press, the founder of the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. The list can go on and on. James Danke, he is a historian. He's an authority on the alternative press. So these two guys together are going to be dynamite. So I'm going to let you start, Dennis. Give us just a few words about yourself, and then share with us how this exhibit came about.
Well, you already essentially gave me a background. As a cartoonist, I've always appreciated the cartoon art of others. And so early on, before there was really a market value attached to it, I was collecting other comic art. Initially, mostly of my peers. We would just swap art. And so I'm a collector by nature. I collect a lot of things. And over the years, accumulated what amounted to a pretty substantial collection of underground comic art in particular. And I've known Jim since forever. He'll remember the exact date. And he shares an interest in all things alternative. So we've been collaborating for quite a while on things revolving mostly around comics. And so the idea of this one really came from both being natural born cheeseheads, or at least I was born in Wisconsin. I think Jim emigrated at some point. And so the idea was to basically present the Midwest as an important segment in the underground comics history, which most people probably ascribe primarily to San Francisco.
Okay. Jim, I'll let you take the floor.
Thanks, Henry. I'm a retired academic. I was the newspapers and periodicals librarian at the premier social history library in the country, the Wisconsin Historical Society, for 35 years. And in 1977, I did a conference on book publishing in Wisconsin. And this all sounds so antiquated, and it is, because in the pre-Google days, it was very hard to discover how you could find the address for somebody who had published, one volume, whether it be it a comic book or book of poetry, it doesn't matter. So I put together a directory of all the book publishers in Wisconsin, and that of course included Kitchen Sink Press. I'd been reading Dennis's stuff, both in comic book form, Mom's Homemade, but also in the Bugle, because the Bugle was distributed in Madison as well as being from Milwaukee. And so we had this conference. Dennis registered for it and paid, I'm sure, the mighty registration fee of $5 or whatever it was. And he introduced himself to me. This is 1977. And I remember he mentioned very specifically, as he just did, that he had a collection of original art. And I very naively said, boy, wouldn't it be great to see that art up on the walls of a museum? So Dennis and I are an overnight success. If overnight constitutes, I don't know, 3+ decades, till we got our show at the Chazen Museum in 2009. It's represented in Underground Classics. And we worked very hard at it, but I think that we didn't have the full appreciation of how fortunate we were to have a sympathetic museum director, Russell Panchenko, who made the exhibit happen in a way that very few other art museum directors would. And we had a very successful show. More than 10,000 people came to see it. And Charlie Kochman did a brilliant book for Abrams, and we felt great. But of course, when you have a really positive experience, as we both did, you think, well, I'd like to do that again. And,
Oh, yeah.
and so a decade later, here we are.
Have you guys had a chance to think about whether this show might end up becoming a traveling show?
We have discussed the options. The thing is, it's in the most obvious one right now, the Wisconsin Museum of Art.
Oh, yeah.
So we have looked at, cities far enough away that might be interested. And I don't know, Jim, did you get a sense that there really were any options?
I don't think so. It is that the very first thing that people think of, I think, or the second thing they think of after they think of having an exhibit of anything. They think, wouldn't it be great to have it travel? Because we've all seen the shows that go from, I don't know, the Louvre to the Art Institute and so forth. And I'm presently waiting for, if I have to break off here because the Louvre is calling me, you'll understand.
Right.
But it's very hard, and I think it probably is a mix of factors such as local experience, traveling shows, expenses, but also of curatorial ego. And that if I thought of it and I ask you if you'd like to host it, Henry, then you might say, well, no, I want to have my own show. And I mean, I really do think that that's an important factor in not being as flexible as guest curators like Dennis and myself might wish.
Well, and also the parochial nature of this show.
Very much so.
Right. I mean, if there was a logical counterpart, I would say maybe one of the Chicago institutions, since we had several Chicago cartoonists involved. Even though it's called Wisconsin Funnies, we broadened it to bring in that little suburb called Chicago. And whereas the earlier show Jim mentioned that was at the Chazen Museum in Madison, we were able to get that one to travel to, of all places, Luzern, Switzerland, to the Kunstmuseum, which was great. But that was also a broad show that covered undergrounds in their entirety. So there was no regional aspect other than it being American. So
I think that if there was a consequence for other museums of Wisconsin Funnies, it would be that someone in the other 49 states plus territories would say, golly, we've got cartoonists, and I'm sure they do, and we should do an exhibit of them, because we think that it's likely that this is the first show that somebody's tried to encompass cartoonists, I have to use my hands here, within a state's boundaries. That there are oodles of thematic shows and catalog raisonné kinds of shows about cartoonists and so forth. Not enough, but a lot. But I'm unaware that someone has done, take your pick, Southern California cartoonists. I mean, it'd be you'd need a big venue, but everybody's got cartoonists.
Well, I could just say, oh, the more the merrier, and everyone we would laugh. But seriously, I think the more the merrier.
Oh, yeah.
And I guess this needs more thinking about, because you could always rebrand it. But I know here in Seattle, for instance, the Seattle Art Museum would certainly welcome you guys. The Fry Art Museum. So, I mean, and that's just me casually coming up with a couple. But let me see about this next part of our talk, if I can just, pardon me, I'm not completely up on, here we go. What I'm doing now is trying to set it up so I can show some slides. And I think we're just about there. Let's see. Now, my first question has to do with comics in an art museum setting. And I'm going to see if this is going to work for me. If not, I do have the catalog. I could refer to that instead. But let me go ahead and ask the question, because I think it's just a matter of this loading up properly. The question is, the catalog itself, on the cover, there's this freaky guy reading 50 years of comics, and this one person quips, "But is it art?" And so I wonder how significant is that question, because that opens up a whole kettle of worms as to the place of comics in art. Let's see, my official question was, it's a very interesting question. Where do you both come down on comics as art? What may constitute a work of comics as art? The whole thing about comics as an art form. What I always find interesting is photography never had to jump so many hurdles as far as I can understand.
Probably did early on though, right?
Yeah, early on.
I think all these things go through stages, and we know that comics in general have been pretty much disrespected for the first 8 or 9 decades of the century. Yeah, there you go. That's a Pete Poplaski's poster and cover.
Yeah, it's a very iconic poster.
Yeah, Pete's wonderful.
Yes.
So I mean, I'm prejudiced, of course, because I'm part of the field, but I always thought, even early on, that comics didn't get enough respect, at least the best ones. There's lots of crappy comics, of course, just like there's lots of crappy fine art and anything that's in the art field. The very best is what deserves the hanging on the walls or the concert halls. But our feeling was, in this area that we know best, we would pick the best and never think twice about whether it really belonged on museum walls. I think we've established that already, a good 10 or 20 years ago.
Yep.
Well, still arguable.
Okay, let me. Go ahead, James.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it is. I just think of it as art. I think of it as comics as the most sophisticated of creative communication, merging text and image in wild varieties. And I think, as Dennis suggested, I mean, my assumption is that it is art, and that I'm also certainly aware, as Pete's dialogue with his partner Rika on the cover of the catalog suggests, that there are tensions, there are arguments that have not for many people not evolved from my youth in the early 50s, where people would say, put down that comic book, read something serious. I read plenty of serious things, but comics are what I enjoyed reading.
Yeah, it's those things that just get stuck, that get so embedded in our culture and our psyche. Now, I'm turning here to a group self-portrait or a comics jam, and this is very, very significant because it has a lot of the players from that era. Dennis Kitchen, of course, starts to line up, and I'm not sure if I'm reading it correctly from clockwise. Don Glassford, Jay Lynch, Jim Mitchell, Wendell Pugh, Bruce Walters, Skip Williamson. I'm going to just pan through here. If there are any thoughts that come to mind, you guys, feel free to jump in. This is such an amazing Jay Lynch piece. I just wonder what's going on here, because the comments are kind of on the obscure side. Would they have been kind of obscure back then, or would they have been more like?
Well, they would have made more sense. Like, I forget, the woman in the middle was an actress from a then very popular sitcom.
Mary Hartman.
Yeah, Mary Hartman, that's right. Guy in the lower left has obviously got a Nancy wig on.
Yeah.
And then you've got Frankenstein commenting on Bushmiller. The Playboy Bunny is probably significant because the Playboy Mansion at that time was in Chicago. So this was done for the Chicago Sun-Times or Tribune Sunday magazine. So it's a Chicago-based humor. That's where Jay lived most of his life. And he specialized in kind of obscure humor. It was very wry and dry, and not necessarily laugh out loud, but more.
No, that's the best. That's the best kind, I think. Well, I'm a fellow cartoonist, so I love all this stuff. I know who Phil Silvers is. Was Phil Silvers from Chicago or a Midwesterner?
Not clear on that.
No, I don't know.
Because here he is, a clear reference to the. I can't remember the name of his show.
Sergeant Bilko.
Right.
Okay. And then here we have Jim Mitchell.
Mitchell, yeah.
And well, I mean, he had quite a sad turn in his life, right? With the marijuana charge.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, he was in a Mexican prison for quite a few years. And then he got out, and then he ended up in a North Dakota prison for a few more years. So a good chunk of his career was curtailed. He's kind of a what might have been situation, because arguably he could have had the easiest breakout career. His style was very commercial. He did very cute cartoons. He probably could have done a daily strip and made some serious money. But by the time he, re-entered, he was way behind, and most people have forgotten who he was.
Well, yeah, it's beautiful work.
Yep.
And then this guy here, Wendell Pugh, this is amazing. This is so weird, but it's it's totally hip. This is what kids are doing today.
Wendell did a lot of drugs. He did a lot of acid and mushrooms. And so I think a lot of his work was inspired by that and possibly drawn while he was in a certain state of mind. I can't say. I was never present when he was actually drawing, but he was definitely out there.
But just the details on that one too, where the headless female figure is squeezing the banana with the smaller female figure inside. You can describe it, but you don't have to understand it.
I have to admit, he's new to me. I'm going to have to look him up. I'm assuming there's some book of his out there.
Well, his very first solo effort was called Googie Wowmer Funnies. And other than that, he appeared in a lot of kitchen sink anthologies. But then at a certain point, probably in the mid-'70s, he left the state, moved to Colorado, and lost all touch with them. I don't think he certainly didn't do any more comics, but I think he continued to do fine art. Mm-hmm. And I think he taught.
Oh, well, fascinating.
When I talked to him to get permissions to include his work in a digital anthology that we did, I mean, he was at least one of his jobs, he was a sign painter in Georgetown, Colorado.
Oh, okay. Well, that's cool. Let me see here now. Bruce Walters, he's new to me as well. Very trippy art.
Yeah, he did a couple of solo comics called OK Comics. And their subtitle was, "They're okay." So he did a lot of, this character, Oscar OK Kabibler, was kind of an everyman American of the time, very middle class, very much in I don't know, the Eisenhower mode era. Mm-hmm. He's another one. I would say the humor is subtle. It's not laugh out loud, but it's something you read, and then a few moments later, it just kind of something in your head snaps, because he just could plug into that. I'll just call it subtly making fun of the middle class, which we all did in one way or another, because we all, of course, thought we were hipper than that generation or two before us that had screwed things up.
Well, isn't that the predominant sense of humor for the 60s, 70s counterculture, a more wry sense of humor?
I think so in general, yes. Although some of it's also quite in your face. We
Yeah.
haven't seen one of those yet.
I went quickly on Don Glassford. Is there anything you would want to say about Mr. Glassford?
Well, he did, the sample you showed was the first 3D underground comic. He just figured out himself how to do 3D, and it's a very complicated process, at least back then. Today you can do it digitally, somewhat easier, but he figured it out, and then he came up with this premise, and the example you showed is the centerfold covering both pages, and it's the east side of Milwaukee exploding with the guy coming toward you holding a pipe, who seems rather oblivious to the fact that he's a mile up in the air. So Don was a very clever guy. Here we have a Skip Williamson self-portrait.
Yeah.
Flippy Skippy.
Yeah.
Well, that's very beautiful work. And anything comes to mind regarding his work, or?
Well, he tended to be more political than most, making fun of the Nixon Agnew crowd, and basically he was friends with some of the Chicago 7 who were arrested in 1968. He did a comic about them called Conspiracy Capers to raise money. So Skip was more overtly political than most.
Well, I was saving this question, but it can be thrown in at any time. What do you think some of these underground cartoonists would make of Trump, since Trump seems like he would scare some of these guys? He's like beyond Nixon. He's like Nixon on acid or beyond. Yeah. Nixon times 100.
Oh, it'd be great to have Skip take on. The other thing I'd add to what Dennis said, though, is that Skip had a long commercial art career. He was art director for Playboy, and did a lot of other things beyond underground comics, but always with the visual panache that you see here.
Yeah. And later in life, he did a lot of oil painting, including some quite large canvases. Mm-hmm. Still in this style, but full color. And he had a gallery in Atlanta, and before he died, he was in southern Vermont, had a gallery there. So he transitioned from being primarily a cartoonist to primarily a painter.
Was he active as a Playboy illustrator, cartoonist around 73, 74, or the end of 70s, or?
Yeah, probably.
Okay, I do vaguely remember him. I would have been a very young boy, but maybe I did somehow. He
did a lot of illustrations for Playboy too. And he did a strip for a while called Neon Vincent that ran in there, that comic strip section.
Now I will go through some of these at a faster clip. Of course, it's a beautiful piece by R. Crumb. And I mean, where do you begin with R. Crumb? I mean, I would love to ask you guys, what was he like? How did he step into your lives? I mean, of course, we know, and there's some beautiful pieces that MOA has done, and you, Dennis, and both of you, Jim and Dennis, you've talked about Crumb on the MOA clips, but man, share with us something about Crumb, if something comes to mind, pops to your minds.
Well, this piece you show is quite sublime. It's called A Short History of America. So you have the same piece of land as it evolves from prior to Americans civilizing this country. It actually ended in the 12th panel originally, where you just see this really ugly street corner.
Yeah.
And then he said, "What next?" And Coevolution Quarterly, Stuart Brand asked him to speculate on what could be next. So then he did 3 possible futures. The one on the left being, we killed ourselves off, and the middle one being very science fiction futuristic, and then the one he favored was the ecotopia.
Mm-hmm.
So it really had kind of a happy ending after all. At least I like to think of it as a happy ending because that's the final panel. But it really, it just forces you to think about what we as humans have done to the planet, for better and mostly worse. But this piece, unless you were maybe a real estate developer, it's probably the least offensive Crumb piece ever. Almost everything else he's done is going to offend people of color, women, people who are politically sensitive of any stripe, because he really can't control his self-censorship. He draws spontaneously and immediately what he's thinking, and that includes any ugly thoughts, any depictions that some people would assume were racist or misogynistic. I think you could argue otherwise, but they come out of his head. And
well, the question here would be, from your experience, do you think it was something that he was putting on his artist hat and saying, I'm going to be commenting on the American psyche, I'm going to expose the American psyche? Was he thinking in those terms? Or do you suspect it was more innocent, where it was like just being wild and crazy? Or,
well, I believe Crumb is on the autistic spectrum. I think he's what we used to call Asperger's. So he's obsessive about drawing. For most of his life, his pen was constantly in his hand with a notebook, and anywhere he went, just sitting in his house or being at a bus station or anywhere, he was constantly drawing. And so whatever idea popped into his head, he would draw. And he didn't have that kind of censorship button that most of us have when we might think a thought, but then we choose not to share it with the world. Robert would just depict it. And in interviews, he said that he just absorbs the culture and he regurgitates it back. And so that culture includes a lot of very ugly imagery. Some of it from, the 20s, 30s. There's certain eras he especially loves, especially the music and the design and so on. And so when he regurgitates it back, it's not a pleasant sight for many. But he's also very insightful and I think brilliant. He's not a highly educated man. He's what you'd call an autodidact, but he's extremely well read.
Mm-hmm.
And he is one of the most honest people I know. And honesty is a dangerous thing, So.
well, I'll move along. Oh, were you going to say something, Jim?
Henry, I'm just going to say is that Crumb is the one artist that all the other cartoonists that follow him that they have to think about, deal with, because of the power of his line. It, as Dennis said, the images may not be what you or even I want to look at sometimes, but the dazzling drawing that he brings to it is just breathtaking. And I've certainly heard enough other cartoonists say that.
Yeah. I mean, even his harshest critics will say he's a sublime draftsman, no question.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
I will go through some of these on a faster clip, and if there's any thought that comes to mind, specifically Dennis, because you've worked with these gentlemen. Here's Will Elder.
Oh, yeah.
There's Harvey Kurtzman. Well, this is a delight.
Yeah.
The grasshopper and the ant. Now, the grasshopper, that hasn't been shown very much, has it? Or
No, well, actually, there is a slim book that takes these panel by panel that was published about 20 years ago. This is basically Kurtzman's beatnik version of the Aesop fable. And it's one of the rare examples of Harvey Kurtzman doing solo work. Typically, he collaborated with others. He was the writer and he would lay out the story. And then artists he considered to be slicker would do the final interpretation. But I'm one of a fair number of people who think Kurtzman himself was just an amazing artist and wished he had done more. In this one, you have just an example here of how throughout the story, it starts out in the spring and everything is predominantly green. And then as you get to autumn, you see it's progressively turning into an ochre orange. And then it ends up in winter with it being predominantly white. So without having to tell you the seasons are changing, it's obvious. But his dialogue is just wonderful. He was an outstanding writer and editor. And this originally appeared in Esquire magazine when they were giving him work. And there's a handful of stories of this caliber, but way too few. Not long after this, he started working for Hugh Hefner doing Little Annie Fanny for the last 25 years of his career. And while that's beautiful in its own right, it's also, for most of us, an example of how his real talent was wasted. It's a strong word, but this should have been what he spent the rest of his life doing, and he couldn't.
yeah. Well, I can see both sides of the story. I mean, who would pass up such an opportunity to do an ongoing thing in a major significant publication?
Yeah, absolutely.
At the same time, it had its limitations, so it took away from him doing something else, for sure.
And for anyone who wants to know more about Harvey, then there's a wonderful book that Dennis and Paul Buell did, devoted to him, that really has great illustrations and wonderful essays too.
Well, I want to take an opportunity to mention Paul Buell. He is one of the I don't know what the designation is. You guys are the curators, and then I guess Paul is the guest curator or associate curator. I'm not sure. He's one of the curators.
He contributed an essay to it because he's part of our old gang.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, we don't want to not include J. Tyler
Right.
Friedman. I've seen his videos. He's a brilliant young man.
We should also mention, actually, our co-curator was Tyler Friedman, who's permanent employee at the museum, but it was really the three of us who did the collaboration here.
Yes.
I want to make sure he gets mentioned.
And of course, Will Eisner. And he's really, I love the little joke over on the right side. So he's really hip to what's going on. And as you say, he was hip in so many ways. I mean, he was already talking about graphic novels back in the 40s.
Yep.
And he was anticipating these things. And I just have to jump in. There's so many ways to tackle this. You said you were skeptical. You weren't sure where a graphic novel was heading, but at the same time, you were right in the thick of it. Do you think sometimes you were so in the thick of it you didn't realize what a special place you were in? Because you were right in it, Dennis. Did you not sometimes pause and say, "Man, I'm making history"?
Well, we were busy. I don't recall ever consciously thinking, gosh, I'm part of history here. What I was consciously aware of was just how cool it was to work with people like Kurtzman and Elder and Eisner, some of the giants of their generation that my generation, really bowed at the feet of. So we knew that was special. And when Will in 1977 started work on what he called a graphic novel, it certainly did seem like a revolutionary thing. Didn't realize that it would spawn what is now really the, you know, what mainstream comics are. Comic books are the ones that now are antiquated and hard to find and probably soon to be extinct, whereas the graphic novel just seems like such a logical thing. But in the late 70s, it was still, it wasn't realistic. It was like, how could the market possibly support such a thing? After all, you know, most people look down on comics, especially people who run bookstores and big publishing companies. But Will's graphic novel in 1978, A Contract with God, really was the spark that changed all of that. So it was history in the making. But at the time, you know, we were just doing what we were doing.
I want to jump in and ask you, James, if you want to maybe share with us something about, from your bountiful insight on the alternative press. Where can you describe maybe the alternative press in its heyday in the 60s and 70s,
Sure.
if you want to call that the heyday, and where do you see alternative press today?
I'm happy to refer to it as the heyday. I was in high school and I started reading Art Kunken's new creation, the Los Angeles Free Press, and I'm sure it changed my life, just as my subsequent but pretty quick discovery of Paul Krasner's The Realist. Those would be two of the touchstones to me. And as I pursued a serious academic career in college and then working at the Historical Society, I just didn't dispose of those interests, so that I would suggest, you know, when people would ask for help with a term paper in the UW campus or through the Post, I would suggest alternative press sources to them, of all kinds. They could be newspapers, they could be pamphlets, it didn't matter. Fortunately, I worked at an institution where we got all the Wisconsin weekly newspapers and all those things you'd expect a state historical institution to have. But we also we collected underground comics, and we had copies of what are some of the very first underground comics. I want to say, boy, Dennis will have to help me out here, but Lenny of Laredo and Joel Beck, and things really from the very, very beginning. And
right, actually pre-Zap. Yeah.
Pre-Zap, yeah. And those were already in the collection. And so when I was hired and I looked at those and I thought, my gosh, if they have those, then I'll bet they'd like a lot more. And so we subscribed to every alternative paper in the country, of which was literally at least one, or if not two, for every college town and major city in the whole country. So it was an avalanche of print rolling through. And became the basis for my first book in 1974. And really, I've just never looked back. I've been a champion of the alternative press. I'd say it really goes from 64 with the LA Free Press, and the next year the Berkeley Barb and Evo, and then to about 1975, and really with the end of the draft, the end of the formal end of the war in Vietnam, that the economic basis for free distribution papers, or papers at a quarter or something like that, begins to fall apart, and they're succeeded by the now almost completely extinct alternative news weeklies that you find in most cities. Gosh, this is Seattle's, I can't think of it for the moment. But
The Stranger?
The Stranger, yeah. I mean, it's papers that used to be in distribution, coin boxes, even if there were no coins, on street corners. But when you'd go and grab, like the Chicago Reader, it almost took two hands, it was so big. But now they're all down because of the web, et cetera. They're down to just thin little things, if they exist at all.
Yeah.
My job was to acquire the print materials that were being produced by the culture at the time. And it gave me an opportunity very frequently to meet not just Dennis, of course, but also just meet all kinds of people who were in the process of producing them, because if they came through Madison or they picked up the phone, they were just interested in why a library in Wisconsin would be interested in their publication. And it's a reasonable question, and yet we were.
Well, I'll just move on. I'm mindful of our time. I'm trying to pack in as much as I can. Of course, we don't want to leave out Stan Lee, Stan the man.
Yeah.
And of course, a lot of things have been said. Oh, he's like a grandstander, and he's did this, he did that. But what was your experience with Stan, Dennis?
Well, he was a grandstander, or as Will Eisner used to call him, a carnival barker. But in my own experience with him, he was a gentleman and he was always fair. And I can't really say bad things about Stan. Others will. This magazine I ended up doing for him really came from an unusual relationship we had early on when I published my first comic, and I sent one to him just on a lark because I was a fan of the Marvel line. And it began kind of a pen pal relationship, and before long he started offering me a job to come to New York and work for Marvel, which 99 out of 100 comics fans would have jumped on the next plane and taken. But because I had my own thing going, I said no, I declined, and that seemed to make him even more eager to convince me. And finally, our interest kind of coincided when in the summer of '73, the underground comics business model was seriously threatened by a Supreme Court decision on obscenity, plus a kind of a glut in the market. And so at that moment, with Kitchen Sink and Krupp on the verge of collapse, I called him and I said, you know what, maybe I would like to work for Marvel. And so we worked out this experimental magazine called Comics Book that was supposed to take the energy, vitality of underground comics and plug it into Marvel's distribution system and marketing savvy. And you know, we produced 5 issues and they were interesting, and it certainly wasn't what you'd call a success, but in terms of ultimately surviving, but it for a while injected a significant amount of money into the pockets of the underground cartoonists who participated, which was most of them. And Stan thought it made him look a little hipper and cooler with the college set that he was lecturing at in those days. So it was kind of a win-win. And at the end of it, my company had managed to revive itself and move on. But had I not taken that year off and worked for him, I suspect Kitchen Sink would have gone under, and my own life career would have taken a different turn. So I'll always be grateful for that opportunity. And the fact that Stan was open-minded enough to let it happen and to let us break all the normal rules at Marvel.
I was looking over the Wikipedia on Kitchen Sink and your Wikipedia, and I did notice that Dark Horse released a recent volume of a comics book.
Yeah, they did the Best of Comics book, and Stan wrote an intro for it shortly before he died.
Oh, I'll go through some of these a little quicker. Ernie Marshmallow, that's a delightful comic strip. I wanted to ask you, how difficult was it for you to reprint these old comics? I guess some of them were in the public domain, or were there rights issues, or?
No, for an exhibition, you don't need permission because you're exhibiting the original art. You're not using it for commercial, profitable purposes.
Well, I meant when you published.
Oh, when I did the Nancy books that I did. Those were licensed officially. I had to go to the syndicate. Yeah.
Okay, and I know that Bill Sanders is near and dear to your heart, and what a beautiful style. And you can see here the paste up when they had to paste the text on there with I could have
Yep.
been just the most
Most
crudest way.
cartoonists hand letter, but yeah, he preferred, because that's what he used in his editorial cartoon. So it was his natural style.
And
And
the
then-
paste up that you see there, Henry, is it's the reflection of the same taste that you see in Masters of American Comics or Underground Classics. Very conscious decision to emphasize that the works on display are original.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I don't know what to say about this. That's J. Edgar Hoover, of course. Can you describe to us what it was like back then for you? You got a chance to be right in the thick of being a journalist, cartoonist, I guess. Dennis, or
What was it like? You mean in regard to the Bugle or in general? What?
you having such a big role in the alternative journalism of that era.
Well, yeah, remember I was juggling hats, and I was a publisher by day and sometimes cartoonist by night, and also starting a family and other things. So as we joked about earlier, I wasn't necessarily conscious of what we were doing being something that would be in a museum a few decades later. The Bugle for me was an opportunity to put the journalism school that I attended into practice, but in a more palatable form, that more journalism for our generation. Obviously, I grew up in Wisconsin reading the Milwaukee Journal mostly, sometimes the Milwaukee Sentinel, sometimes the Chicago paper. And I got my news from them in a way that a lot of people today don't anymore. But at the same time, they had to be stuffed with advertising and all kinds of things that were not of interest to me or my generation. The alternative press was really an opportunity for young journalists and artists to speak to our peers and nobody else. And so in this case, we were not a fan of J. Edgar Hoover. We were not a fan of police in general, or the government in general. And so we vented. And I think it was a healthy vent. And we did some investigative journalism that probably still holds up. And we did some cartoons that were, throwing barbs at a lot of people we didn't like. And I think overall it was a healthy thing. And I think every generation in its own way rebels. Ours was a bit unique in that I think offset printing made it affordable for us to have our own newspaper, whereas a generation earlier, you would have had to have been a trust baby to start your own newspaper. And Jim covers that in the essay he wrote in the catalog too, which is offset printing really made a lot of what we did possible.
Yeah.
Very good point. Well, I won't keep you guys for much longer. I'm just going to try to barrel through a little bit. This one's a beautiful piece, Major Arcana. Yeah. Then this one, I'm just curious about Michael Newhall. He seems like a mysterious figure in all this, and Buddha crackers, which kind of adds to the mystery. I found out this is not a graphic novel. It was just like a little short piece, right? Or what's the story?
Yes, this was in a comic called Mondo Snarfo, which was a deliberately surrealistic comic. I had always been a fan of the surrealist school, and I thought other cartoonists were too. So we did a deliberately surreal comic in the sense that it used the structure of comics, but the stories were more stream of consciousness, not plot driven. And so it was intended that you would kind of lose yourself in the artist's imagination and not read it from A to Z and get a story out of it, but just be more of an immersive graphic experience. And Mike Newell was perfect for it because, again, he largely came from he's a serious painter, and he was also probably the last of the scrimshaw artists before ivory was justifiably outlawed. He made a living selling scrimshaw, but I knew he would be terrific at this, and so I think he retired after doing 2 stories.
Well, he certainly caught my eye.
Oh, yeah.
I go through a few more, and then I would say we're done. This one, ITT Scandal, it grabs my attention because I'm a political junkie. So it is this kind of surreal because, of course, it's kind of vaguely disguised references to things. I guess ITT is AT&T, and then
No, it's ITT is different corporation actually.
Okay,
They're an early conglomerate. And
tell us the story behind it then.
well, ITT is among other things, they're going to be a key business element in overthrowing Allende in Chile, and it's not just the telephone company. They owned they owned lots and lots of other things, and in here, Pete Poplasky and others are working to help unveil all of their nefarious work with undermining the Democratic Party when Nixon's running for re-election.
And Pete Poplasky, the same guy who did the poster you started out with, he drew this deliberately in his Chester Gould style, so it looks like a Dick Tracy comic.
It does. It really does.
There is so much behind the scenes, you guys, when I try to do an interview, and then a double interview with 2 huge figures, it just blows my mind. I was not able to actually sit down and read this piece. I had meant to, so I kind of went in blind. But my apologies. I move on. There's the great Trina Robbins.
Yes,
that's one of the least risque page, but that's fabulous. That is fabulous. I know Trina has said this, where she can show up the guys and be just as risque and then some. So I think she would make a lot of underground cartoonists blush. But her work is delightful.
mm-hmm.
And, this guy's another mysterious figure, Mark Morrison. I really am taken with this. Kind of makes me think of Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah. These the birds there are the real stars to me. The dialogue is principally theirs, and they're again it's humor that I think a few seconds after you read it, something snaps in your brain, and it's very offbeat. Mark Morrison was a Madison native who, after a few comics, just disappeared, and he ended up actually committing suicide, and it's another sad story. But I wished he had been more successful in comics, but he had his fans, but not enough that he felt he could make a living doing it.
And moving right along, we have to mention Linda Barry, of course.
Of course. Yeah.
It's
you mean Associate Professor of Art, Linda Barry, at the University of Wisconsin? Anyway, MacArthur Award winner.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's she's all that and much, much more. She's an evangelist for drawing and writing.
Yep. She really is a national treasure who happens to be, Wisconsin's own now.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a delight to be able to include her in the show.
Yes.
I will just go through a few more because there's so much. I'm only touching on some of the highlights. So please, folks, do yourself a favor, go see the show, which has been extended into January.
Yes.
This is
Jeff Butler.
Jeff Butler, Badger, Wisconsin's own superhero.
Yep.
There's Nexus, Mike Barron and Steve Rude.
Right.
And then Kings in Disguise, which it really intrigues me. I will have to get the graphic novel for this. I know
If
this
you
is.
haven't, yeah, Henry, if you haven't read it, it's really one of the best.
It is.
I'm actually closing with this, and I want to allow you guys to, if you have any closing thoughts, feel free to, anything to spread the word. Any closing thoughts about Wisconsin Funnies?
Buy our book.
Yeah.
Oh,
It's a treasure trove.
we don't get any royalties from it, but we're pretty ginormously proud of it, and it's a treat to get to do this.
Yeah, it was great to do a regional show, and I hope maybe it does inspire similar regional shows, as you said from the beginning, because virtually every state, probably with someone doing a little homework, would come up with a lineup of cartoonists. So we're delighted that you appreciated it, even though you're in faraway Washington State.
I keep thinking I'm going to go see this show, but I don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah.
I mean, but anyway, this has been a real treat. Thanks so much to both of you, to you, Jim, and to you, Dennis. Thank you so much.
Pleasure talking to you, Henry. Thank you.
Thanks, Henry.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.